Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to part 4 of my video series where I'm sharing the meanings that I use when I work with Kipper cards. If you're just joining me for the series, I'd like to start off by giving you a recap. So the video series was inspired by one of my regular viewers. Her name is Carolyn, and at the time Carolyn had asked me if I would be willing to do much like I did in my video series where I talked about the meanings that I use when I work with Lenormand. She asked this time would I be willing to work with Kipper cards. She went one step further in her request, and she asked if I would work with a particular deck. So the deck that has been assisting me throughout the series is the Siècle Kipper cards. They are by Ciro Marchetti, and they are published by US Game Systems Incorporated. So in the first 3 parts of this video series, we covered cards 1 through 18, because what I do is I typically work with a group of 6 at a time, so each video has had 6 cards covered. And so now we're halfway through the deck, and in this video installment we're going to be taking a look at cards 19, which is Coffin, up to card 24, which is Thief. So now that I've talked a little bit about the inspiration, I've talked about the deck being used, I talked about the format, let's now take a closer look at the cards for this video installment, starting with card 19, which is Coffin. And here we are with card 19 in the deck, and card 19 is Coffin. This card is also known as bereavement. Coffin can represent an ending or completion. It can also represent closure and something being made final or having some sense of finality to it. I tend to look at Coffin as termination or the idea of coming to terms with something. Now, because this card is also known as bereavement, this card can mean mourning a loss. And I tend to look at this card as the equivalent to Coffin in Lenormand. So some of the meanings that I have for that card in the Lenormand sense, I usually carry over in the Kipper sense as well. So some additional meanings I have for Coffin are things like bed, if you consider Coffin to be a place where one is put to rest or to sleep. So I tend to think of bed, rest, and sleep with this card. And because of the size and the nature of a coffin, I tend to think of limitation and restriction, because it's a tight space. And playing off on that idea some more, I tend to look at Coffin as representing a box or some kind of storage container. So for example, something like a trunk. But it can also represent anything that has some kind of closure on it or something that can be closed. Coffin can represent nothing or no. There is a traditional method of reading Kipper that I learned some time ago, and when the Coffin card comes up, it can represent something coming to a halt. It's like a stop card. Now, some people have the idea that Coffin can mean transformation, so I will include that here. And Coffin can represent something dark or darkness. For me personally, Coffin in Lenormand has been one of my headache cards, so I carry that interpretation or meaning over to this card as well. So for me, this card can represent headaches. Now, this card is also a timing card, and it can represent something taking place at night or in the evening. So summing up, Coffin traditionally represents an ending or a completion. And so now let's move on to card 20 in the deck. And now we're at card 20 in the deck, and card 20 is house. So house can represent an actual house or home. It could represent one's home life. And with that, it can represent family. House would also suggest those people that you live with, if it's not family, but anyone that you share living space with. is the idea of people who live under the same roof with one another. Now, house is also a card that can represent property and real estate. And playing on that idea, then house can also represent one's neighborhood. Now, from an emotional standpoint, house is a card that can represent the idea of safety, feeling safe, security, feeling secure, and stability. I also look at house as a card of foundation because homes are built on foundations. And with that, house can also represent ownership, playing on the idea of property and real estate. And going from the emotional standpoint, where I talked about the ideas of feeling safe and secure, in that regard, house can also come up when there's a need for confidence. Now, I have some carryover meanings from house in Lenormand that I attribute to the house card here in Kipper. So some of these additional meanings I have are business. So I tend to look at house as a small business card, a home-based business card, or a family-owned business card. And then the last thing that I want to say about the house card is that this is a timing card, and it can represent a time period of 6 months. And that's playing on the idea that it takes 6 months to settle into a new home. So summing up, house can represent an actual house or home, or one's home life and family. And so now let's move on to the next card in the deck, card 21. And here we are with card 21 in the deck, and card 21 is family room. My chief meaning for this card is personal space. And playing on that, I tend to look at family room as privacy and intimacy. Now, this card can represent an actual room. So some examples would be a living room, playing the idea of family room. And traditionally, this card is also known as living room. But it can also represent a home office or an office in a building. Family room can represent a hotel or motel room or an apartment. Basically, the criteria for the room, it has to have a door, which would allow personal space, privacy, and intimacy. Now, because of the intimate nature of this card can suggest something close or something that's going to be taking place very soon, playing on the idea of in the same room. And then the last thing that I want to say about family room is that this is a timing card, and it can represent a time period of 24 hours to 4 weeks. So summing up family room represents personal space, privacy, and intimacy. And so now let's move on to card 22 in the deck. And here we are with card 22 in the deck, and card 22 is official person. So official person is a person card, and it can represent a military person, a police officer, or a fireman. Basically, any person who wears a uniform. I also tend to look at official person as someone in office, playing on the word official. So this could be somebody who holds public office or somebody who is a public authority figure. And playing on that, this can describe somebody who is disciplined, somebody who follows rules or regulations, somebody who is ordered or orderly, and someone who's structured. So in that sense, if official person is not about a person, then it can also represent things like discipline or rules and regulations or order and structure. And then the last thing that I want to say about official person, this can be describing something as becoming official. Now, official person being a person card, we want to keep direction in mind. And as we've noticed with all the other people cards that have been showing up throughout this series, official person is also looking at us. He's facing us. So if you read traditionally cards on the left to be the past, cards on the right to be the future, you could continue to do that. And as I've noted with other people cards throughout this series, I tend to take into account official person's body language and which way his body is facing. So for me, he's facing my left. So cards on the left of official person for me would represent the future, and cards on the right of official person would represent the past. Now that would be keeping in mind if this card is actually representing a person. But if it is, that's how I would read with direction in mind. So summing up official person is a person card, and as such it can represent any person who wears a uniform. And so now let's move on to card 23 in the deck. And now we're at card 23 in the deck, and card 23 is Courthouse. Courthouse can represent legal matters, but it can also represent administrative procedures and public affairs. For me, Courthouse can represent a public building, playing on the idea of public affairs. And so some examples would be City Hall, the DMV, which is the Department of Motor Vehicles, or a post office. I tend to look at Courthouse as representing government, and so that could be on the state or federal level. And if we're talking about a situation that's not a legal matter and Courthouse turns up, it could represent a decision needing to be made regarding some kind of dispute. The dispute does not have to be legal in nature for this card to turn up. And then a personal meaning that I have for this card is it can turn up when there's a need for balance, playing on the idea of legal matters and legal activity. Then the scales of justice, and scales can represent balance. So that's where that comes from. So summing up Courthouse, Courthouse can represent legal matters, administrative procedures, and public affairs. And if it's not about any of those things, then it can turn up when there's a decision that needs to be made regarding some kind of dispute. And so now let's move on to the final card in this video segment, which is card 24. And now we're at card 24, the final card for this video segment of our series. And card 24 is Thief. So generally speaking, this card can represent loss or theft. Thief can suggest something that's taken and or stolen. It can talk about this feeling or the sense of being robbed or cheated. And playing on that sense some more, thief can represent fraud, and with that the sense of being taken. Now earlier in this series I talked about card 11, which was sudden wealth, and I had talked about the idea that sudden wealth can represent increase. It can represent multiples of something or many of something. Well, in contrast to that, thief represents the opposite. It can represent something that's actually decreasing. So it can represent a few of something or fewer. Now playing on the image of the card, we have a pickpocket who looks to be taking the watch of the man on the card. So for me, this card can turn up to actually represent losing track of time, playing on the idea that the watch is being stolen. And with that, it can represent time lost that you can't get back. The idea like once it's gone, it's gone. Now playing on the idea of loss some more, thief can represent something that we're missing out on. And then the last thing that I want to say about the thief card is I tend to look at this with direction in mind. And so because the pickpocket is on the right hand side of the card, I tend to look at cards on the right of thief to suggest the possibility of what is being lost, taken, removed, or decreased. So summing up, thief can represent loss or theft. And that will bring this installment of our series to a close. We've covered 24 cards, and now we're 2/3 of the way through the deck. I'm James Himm Mitchell, and I'd like to thank you for being here with me, and I look forward to being with you again for part 5, where we'll look at the next 6 cards in the deck, cards 25 to 30. So until then, I'm hoping you have a wonderful day. Take care.